When Influence Becomes Identity. Robert Cialdini and the Psychology of Persuasion. Robert Cialdini's Influence is often treated as a book about persuasion, salesmanship, and marketing. But its deeper significance reaches much further. Cialdini's work helps explain how ordinary people make decisions when they do not have the time, knowledge, or ability to independently evaluate every claim placed in front of them. We rely on psychological shortcuts. Most of the time, those shortcuts are useful. But they can also make us vulnerable to charismatic personalities, ideological movements, advertising, political leaders, and media figures who understand how those shortcuts work. This becomes particularly interesting when we consider personalities such as Dave Ramsey and Robert Kiyosaki. Their financial philosophies provide a useful juxtaposition. Ramsey emphasizes eliminating debt, discipline, sacrifice, and financial security. Kiyosaki has emphasized financial education, assets, entrepreneurship, and the strategic use of leverage. The question isn't necessarily which philosophy is universally correct. Both approaches involve assumptions about risk, debt, wealth, and personal responsibility. The more interesting psychological question is why someone can become so attached to one worldview that an alternative begins to feel not merely incorrect, but morally wrong. Cialdini's answer begins with authority. Human beings cannot personally investigate everything they encounter. We depend on people who appear knowledgeable. A doctor, mechanic, economist, professor, or financial advisor can provide information that would take us years to independently acquire. Cialdini identified authority as one of the powerful principles influencing human behavior. But authority isn't communicated exclusively through credentials. It is also communicated through confidence, certainty, reputation, appearance, and the ability to speak decisively. This helps explain why tone of voice can matter so much. Someone who says, "There are several possibilities, and the answer depends on your circumstances," may actually be providing the more intellectually responsible answer. Yet someone who says, "Listen, I've been doing this for 30 years. Here's exactly what you need to do," often sounds more authoritative. Confidence can become psychologically confused with competence, and competence can become confused with truth. Then comes liking. People are more receptive to people they like. This becomes especially powerful with radio and television personalities because audiences can hear the same person repeatedly for years. They hear the jokes, stories, frustrations, opinions, and moral judgments. Eventually, the voice becomes familiar. The personality can begin to feel less like a distant public figure and more like someone the listener knows personally. This is where Cialdini's work intersects with Donald Horton and Richard Wohl's concept of the parasocial relationship. A listener can develop a psychological relationship with a person they have never met. The relationship is one-sided, but the emotional experience can still feel remarkably real. That creates a powerful combination. Familiarity becomes trust, and trust becomes authority. Cialdini's principle of social proof adds another layer. When people aren't certain what to believe or how to behave, they often look at what other people are doing. Solomon Asch demonstrated something similar through his famous conformity experiments. People could see the correct answer but still conform to an obviously incorrect group answer. Now imagine that laboratory experiment transformed into modern mass media. Instead of 6 people sitting around a table, there are millions of listeners, callers, comments, social media followers, testimonials, and enthusiastic supporters. The message becomes, "Look how many people agree with us." The crowd itself becomes evidence. That transformation is extremely powerful because people defend their identities much more aggressively than they defend individual facts. Cialdini's principle of reciprocity adds another dimension. If a personality has provided years of free advice, entertainment, motivation, and emotional support, the audience can begin to feel that the personality has given them something. That can create loyalty. The relationship becomes psychologically reciprocal even though the media personality may never know the individual listener exists. "He's helped me" can quietly become "I trust him." And "I trust him" can eventually become "I believe him." The distinction is crucial. Finally, Cialdini's later work added unity, which may be the most powerful principle for understanding ideological movements. Unity goes beyond simply liking someone. It concerns the perception that the communicator and audience belong to the same group. There is an enormous difference between saying, "I agree with this person," and "this person is one of us." Once a personality becomes a representative of our people, disagreement can become socially threatening. The leader is no longer merely expressing an opinion. The leader is representing the identity of the group. At this point, Cialdini's ideas begin connecting with Henri Tajfel and John Turner's social identity theory, Stanley Milgram's work on authority, Solomon Asch's conformity research, Irving Janis's groupthink, and Leon Festinger's work on cognitive dissonance. Together, these ideas suggest a progression. Authority creates trust. Liking creates familiarity. Social proof creates consensus. Commitment creates consistency. Reciprocity creates loyalty. Unity creates identity. And identity can create the blinders. This is why the most interesting question isn't whether Dave Ramsey is right or Robert Kiyosaki is right. The deeper question is what happens when a financial philosophy becomes attached to a person's sense of morality, belonging, and self-worth. At that point, the debate stops being simply about debt. It becomes a conflict between identities. The same thing can happen in politics, religion, economics, health, conspiracy theories, and countless other areas of modern life. A charismatic personality can become a cognitive shortcut, a trusted filter through which the audience evaluates everything else. The danger isn't that people listen to experts. We need experts. The danger begins when trust in the messenger becomes a substitute for evaluating the message. Cialdini's work, therefore, isn't merely a manual for understanding how people persuade one another. It is also a warning about how easily our own psychological shortcuts can be used against us. The ultimate question is not whether we are influenced. We all are. The question is whether we remain capable of stepping back from the person we trust and asking a much harder question. If someone I admire told me something I didn't want to believe, would I still be willing to examine the evidence? That may be one of the clearest tests of independent thought. Because influence becomes dangerous not when someone changes our mind, but when we become so attached to the person doing the influencing that we no longer realize our mind is being changed. This is where the psychological power of a media personality becomes especially interesting. The personality doesn't merely provide an argument. The personality provides an entire social environment in which the argument appears normal. Cialdini's principle of commitment and consistency explains how an initial preference can gradually become an ideology. A person might begin by saying, "I like this guy's financial advice." Then they begin following the advice. They experience success. They tell other people about it. They identify themselves with the philosophy. Eventually, changing their mind becomes psychologically expensive. They aren't simply reconsidering an economic proposition. They may have to reconsider decisions they made, sacrifices they endured, people they criticized, and the identity they constructed around those choices. This is where the psychological blinders begin to appear. Suppose someone believes that being debt-free is not simply financially advantageous, but morally virtuous. They encounter an argument that, under certain circumstances, carefully managed leverage can be used to acquire productive assets. They may not hear the argument as a neutral financial proposition. They may hear, "Irresponsible people are smarter than responsible people." The financial argument has been transformed into a moral conflict.
Mr. Lee, is this you talking or the...